Yeah, can you feel it? We are getting towards the end of the semester. And it doesn't matter whether this is accurate and you are in week 8 of December 8th, 2019, or if you're a 2020 class or even beyond. I'm making a video today to discuss this concept right here, the final exegetical paper. And so you could be a class that is using the passage of Philippians 2. You could be using Ephesians 2, or you might be using one of my Romans passages. It makes no difference. This video is intended to explain some additional things on how to do the final exegetical paper. So let's get started. First of all, notice that there is an exegetical guide. If you click on the exegetical guide, you should get a PDF document like this. And this page one is totally comprehensive of just an overview of what we're doing here. There's an introductory title page, which has the theme of the book, main idea of the passage, an outline of the passage, which we'll preview in a moment. There is an introduction that you need to have. There's a context section. There is a content section. There is an application that you need to do and live out. And then, of course, a works cited or bibliography. And included, there is commentaries that will need to be used. There is also a word study, which you've already done, and background tools, which you should already have from doing your historical cultural paper. So let me scroll down a bit. There's also going to be journals that you need to utilize in this paper, and we haven't worked with journals yet, and so you might need to go back to the Converge page and watch the video here on how to access journals from Corban's website on our passage, know how to select journals and how to interact with them. So that might be something to start with. But since this is an overview, let me just go ahead and show you an example. After page 1 and 2, explaining kind of the exegetical paper, or at least the outline of it, I then go straight into an example. And here is just kind of a cover page. Remember, most of your assignments should have a cover page with your name and the assignment. But the first real page is the one that we saw, the one that we saw that has the theme statement of the book. So if you're studying the book of Ephesians or Philippians or Romans, this is where you're going to state the theme of the book. And remember that we've already done this once. We had a literary context assignment and an observation assignment that asked you to find the theme of the book. So you might want to go back to one of your previous assignments and see my comments on your theme and whether I liked it or I wanted you to modify it in any way. But don't start with something brand new here. You don't need to go look into a commentary. If you want a good grade on the theme statement of the book section, go back to your previous assignment and look at my notes and grading. The main idea of the passage, so whatever 10 or 11 verses we're looking at, whatever our passage is, what's the main idea? Try and get it into a sentence or two at most, but try and get it down into kind of one cohesive thought. And at the bottom here is an outline of the passage. Again, the passage is whatever the verses are that we're studying. Try to break them apart. And here I have an example from the book of James. Faith to be real, saving faith must be acted out. This is verse 14. Verses 15 through 17 go together here, and 18 through 19 here. The big question in the outline is, how do you break apart your verses, and what kind of title can you give them? Make sure that you include all of the verses, like don't skip a verse. Make sure that they're all included, and you can get it as to many points as you want. In general, maybe a 10-verse passage should have 3 or 4 points. It's possible to have 2, but it certainly isn't 1, and it's probably not 6 or 7. So we're kind of shooting for something about like that. Please don't consult commentaries or, try and find an outline on the web. I want to know how you see the passage flowing together. The blah, blah, blahs, by the way, is letting you know about the length. The theme statement should be about 1 line, maybe 1.5, but probably not 2. The main idea of the passage should be about 3. And since I wanted you to see the wording of a real example here, I gave you that from James. Okay, let's do the introduction. The introduction, my hint is to do this absolutely last. Because a good introduction should do 2 things. A good introduction should not only give me content of what your passage is about, but it should also interest me and be creative. So general good ideas about interesting or creative. Maybe a story that's short. maybe a metaphor, a quote, a bold statement, a situation you're describing, whether it's real life or it's theoretical. But you want to get my attention, interest the reader. Do not start this the boring way that here's a paper that's going to be, about this passage. Don't do that. Make it interesting and creative. And the other part is make sure that whatever your hook is, whatever your story, your metaphor, your quote is, it's getting at content. It's getting at the punch of the passage. So if your passage is about grace, hook me with grace. If your passage is about humility, hook me with humility as a good example. But that's the introduction. I think this is best to do last after you've already done the whole paper, because I think then you can really see clearly what your passage is about. Okay, the next section is context, and if you're wondering, yes, please do use black, bolded, underlined headers like this. I'm writing in red, so you know that this isn't an example, it's my notes to you. But basically, I like this format of seeing. This is the introduction section, this is the context. The context section has two parts. It should begin with the historical, cultural context about the city. The people in the city that's being addressed, Paul, and what the situation was like. Remember, we already did this. This was part of the historical cultural context paper that you already turned in and I already gave feedback on. So basically, I'd like you to go back to that paper and I'd like you to see if I gave you any comments, any things to add or fix. And if you got a perfect score A, perfect, then what you can do is you can put all of the part 1 of that paper, not the whole paper, note, not the whole historical cultural context paper. I do not want you to put in the part 2 stuff, the stuff that was on the specific verses of Ephesians or Philippians or Romans or whatever your passage was. I want the stuff that just covers the city of Ephesus, Philippi, Rome, whatever the city was, and the background things. I just want that put in here. And then after that, still part of the context section, I want you to put the whole literary context paper. Why? Well, because as this paper begins, you have a creative, clever introduction hooking me, but then you have this context section which walks me through all the historical, cultural, and then even the literary context so that I'm ready to start your paper. So this is all kind of introductory stuff. And remember, you already did the literary context. It had 3 parts. It had the theme of the book. It had the before section and the after section. Most of my students really struggle on literary context. And so make sure that you don't just copy and paste without fixing your mistakes. Okay, so we saw page 1 of this assignment, page 2. And there's more notes for you to read. Page 3 is the content section. Now, the content section is a verse-by-verse analysis, and there's some things you need to know. You need to use commentaries in this section. There are some good commentaries you can find online, but a good suggestion is to, okay, I can accept that you are an online student, so you might not be able to go to Corban's library, but maybe somebody in your church has commentaries on this book. Maybe you could ask your pastor. Maybe your church has a library. Maybe you're close to a different Christian school. So I would hope that you could at least find one print commentary. That is not a hard expectation. I don't know exactly where all my students are at. Maybe you're in a faraway place that doesn't have one. I understand that. And so if you need to use only internet commentaries, you can get away with that. They're just usually terrible, and that's why they're free. Maybe you can get away with going to Amazon or Google Books and being able to see certain pages. Just make sure you cite things. You need to cite the information that you use. But basically, it's going to look like this. I want to see a verse-by-verse analysis. So this is the call to unity and humble living. I took this from Philippians. And I'm sorry, this should be Philippians 2:1-verse 4. And here's verse 1 of Philippians. So if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort in love, or any participation in the Spirit. Okay? Well, this is the verse 1. You'd put it in italics here in indent, and then you would just begin commenting on verse 1 right here. And all I want you to notice is, look at this, Baker. This is a book citation taken from a encyclopedia. This is a historical cultural book that's being used and cited here. This is a commentary that's being used here, Black. And Allen 72 this is actually from a journal article. And so basically, you are to take one verse and you're to look at all these resources, and that means you need to read these resources. Read what the commentary says about verse 1. Read what a journal says about verse 1. Look for any historical, cultural information you have from previous assignment on that specific verse, and you're trying to weave it together with your own observations and your own comments that you had from the Comments A paper, and you're trying to explain this passage with resources like journals and commentaries and historical cultural information and your own ideas, and you want to be as thorough and clean as possible. So just listen to how this sounds. This verse begins with a conditional clause that carries into verse 2. That's a great starting statement. The use of the word if, which is often translated to since, assumes the premise to be true. And that's from a commentary. The student who wrote this didn't think of that on their own. They saw this in a book and said, that's smart, I'm putting it in. The first half of the clause is a list given in the present tense. That sounds like observations to me. That sounds like week 1 stuff. Love it. Each new idea beginning with the word any. In this list, affection is paired with sympathy through the conjunction and. So I'm hearing the students' comments, but I'm also hearing, of course, commentaries, and it sounds smart. And they're going to go through, and they're going to end with a strong summary statement at the end. And this first verse, Paul is setting up for an upcoming imperative by giving the audience a list in the form of a conditional clause. It's not that strong. I mean, I would maybe like to say that Paul is setting up an appeal for unity or something of that matter, but they comment on verse 1, they use all the appropriate resources, and then we get to verse 2. And they're going to continue this on. This may take 5 pages, it may take 8 pages, but they're showing me good verse-by-verse analysis. The last section is the application section. Again, we did an application assignment on Romans 12. Do it the same way. Start with a sentence summarizing the overall meaning of our passage. List a few principles that you wish to explain in the following paragraphs. Remember, emotional responses can be important here too. Is there something I should feel, something I should think, something I should do, something I should stop doing? Is there some zoomed out application things that, wow, this passage calls me to worship? Is there some zoomed out things like in light of this passage, I should share the gospel? Or is there some specific things our passage says that I should do? Remember, I want you to start with summary, give me a list of kind of different kinds of applications, and then you're going to pick one to talk about thoroughly and one to live out. And after you've lived it out, write about how it went. Remember, application has a part A and a part B. B is where you reflect on what you did. Note, you cannot do the same thing that you did for your Romans passage because that is an entirely different passage. You can't do anything in the past because I want you to respond new to this passage, and you probably cannot also make a plan to do later with me because this paper needs to be turned in and graded. If you absolutely ran out of time and you must do an application part B that you don't finish, like in other words, make a plan, you can submit that. You'll lose significant points for it not being lived out because you can't really reflect on it, but that's better than nothing, I suppose, or it's better than being dishonest and saying you did something you didn't do, or being dishonest and taking something from your past and saying you just now did it. So if that happens, I understand, but my goal is that you would live the text and talk about it. The last thing is that there is a works cited page, and I really like you to organize it this way. These are the word study tools from the word study paper we've already did. If you've done a word study for my class, what I want you to do is in the content section, when we're on that specific verse, maybe you studied joy, and in verse 2, I'd like you to give me 3 or 4 good sentences from your word study. What do you mean good sentences? Well, the last section where in the word study you focus on my word means this in our passage, put some of that here. Keep some of the citation of maybe Bible Hub, or if you got to the library and saw some of the library resources, use one of those if you had it. Not a big deal if you don't. But I'd like you to sort of cite that in here too. But in the works cited, we have word study tools, historical cultural books. Those are dictionaries, encyclopedias, and the 2 books that you needed to use on the original historical cultural paper. Remember that now I want commentaries. And so if you use internet sources, cite them appropriately. If you have them in hard copy, make sure that you cite them as well. And then journals. I expect you to use 4 journals. That's a Corban requirement. I know it says 3 here, but there's the number 4 on the last page. And if you need help, look at the video on how to use journals. This is a paper that's worth a third of your grade. If you have any questions and want to work on it early, you can send it to me early and I will give you substantive feedback, tell you what to work on. Thank you so much for watching the video all the way to the end, and good luck.